Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Wrestling News Show, where we are on a mission to teach, learn, and remember the history of professional wrestling with everyone that wants to join us. And John, we're doing 2 episodes today.
Big day. Yes. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Good. Today we're talking about, this is a special episode number 6, where we're talking about Tales from the Territory. We are specifically focusing in on Polynesian Pro Wrestling. So that was the episode from last night, Wrestling's Island Dynasty.
Yeah, it's amazing. I literally know nothing about this territory other than the one episode that you did very early on about the territory. But other than that, literally everything I know comes from Young Rock. So, I'm certain a lot of that has been polished in one way or another, that last night we were going to get some of the real inside stories.
Yes. So it was episode number 3 of this show where I did whatever happened to Polynesian Pro Wrestling. And when I found out this show was happening, I'm like, well, hope I was right, because these guys are certainly going to talk about what happened. So, and in general, I was right. I didn't talk about the extortion charges that were brought against Leah Maivia, but the Hot Summer Night 2 show that only drew 1,900 fans was something that I pointed to. And we can talk about that because there's things that they didn't say on the show that contributed to the reason why Hot Summer Night 2 drew so low. So we can talk about that when we get there. But a pretty good episode. The people that you and I really couldn't pick out last week was Rocky Iakea, who is the son of King Curtis, who was a big star in Polynesian Pro Wrestling. Lars Anderson, who is not Polynesian, he's Caucasian, and he went over there after the death of Peter Maivia. He went over there and helped Leah Maivia run the territory. Kevin Sullivan, who had apparently memorable stint there in Polynesian Pro Wrestling, and Bruno Lauer, who I would never, if you told me Bruno Lauer, I would not know who you're talking about. But if you said Harvey Wimpleman, I would know exactly who you're talking about.
And once again, I don't want to lean on this like a crutch, because obviously I know it's part fiction, but it took me almost to the end of the season 1 of Young Rock to put together that Downtown Bruno, his buddy that he spent all this time with, was Harvey freaking Whippleman. Like,
Yeah.
I had no idea. And even seeing him last night, now, he's older, he's got the bald head, but he doesn't seem like that, to use an old wrestling phrase, that pencil neck geek that was the Harvey Whippleman character. I'm not sure I would have guessed that's who that was, even sitting there just staring at his face and listening to him talk.
It's funny too, because such a memorable character in wrestling is Harvey Wimpleman. But
yeah.
So a lot of this we're talking about the early 80s, and yes, before that, but a lot of what we're talking about was in the 80s. And I was surprised to hear some of the reasoning why Polynesian Pro Wrestling was so enormous. It's surrounded by thousands of miles of water, and it's the most remote outpost of the National Wrestling Alliance. And apparently the reason why it was so important is that planes had to stop there to refuel. Not something they have to do today, but a nice layover, I guess. So the wrestlers had to stop there if they were going to Japan, so might as well, get a payday.
Yeah, it's incredible. It was for the same reason that it's, our 50th state, because it was strategic. It's this beautiful little cluster of islands midway between our West Coast and Japan, and it worked out for wrestling as well.
Right. So, the High Chief Peter Maivia is the central character, right, of Polynesian Pro Wrestling, and it is interesting. He's trained in New Zealand. He started Polynesian Pro with his wife. He put Samoans on the map, so to speak, and in the process, not really so much during his lifetime would he know that he started a multi-generational dynasty in wrestling. And I think Rocky Iakea says it really well when he says, Polynesian people, the people from the various islands in the Pacific, are relatively small in number,
Yes.
and their impact on the professional wrestling business far outweighs their numbers. It's way disproportionate.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't know if that's maybe, he talked about how when you were on the islands, when TV first came in, there was like 3 channels. Like, obviously, same thing was here on the mainland, but I guess maybe it lasted a little longer out there for, broadcast reasons and whatnot. But so wrestling was always on, and you
Yeah.
watched wrestling or you watched nothing, and it almost became kind of like the Islanders' national pastime. Like, he doesn't say that, I'm not putting words in his mouth, but it just became like it was just what you did. Like, growing up here on the mainland states, you probably played little league, even if you punched out after t-ball or whatever. You probably played some baseball. Out there, you watched and were engulfed by wrestling.
What's interesting about pro wrestling, and we don't talk about it probably enough, is that it can be at times a way of um, exuding nationalistic pride. And you probably remember or have looked back in like the 80s. There was always a Corporal Kirshner or a Hacksaw Jim Duggan fighting a Russian of some kind or a German of some kind. And in the following the 1940s, if somebody from Japan came to the United States, they were a bad guy. If
Instant.
one of us went over there, we were bad guys. It didn't matter how over they were in their home country. If you went to the other side, you were a big time heel.
Yeah.
And in Polynesian Pro, if you were from the islands, you were a face, and if you were not from the islands, you were a heel. So they talked about all the great big faces that went to the islands, and they were all heels.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. The white guys came in, the mainlanders came in, and that's instant heel status before you open your mouth.
Yeah, and the reason it's so good for nationalistic pride is that it's predetermined, and you can put the hometown hero over, and in a manner of speaking, you can kind of create your own great story. So so that's what they did a lot. And when Leah Maivia took over the territory, that was certainly the what she was going after in all the angles. It seemed like, that keeping the hometown people kind of on top. There were stories that they told where, like, the most memorable story was the one where it was King Curtis versus Nef Maivia,
Right.
and it was the riot that happened. And this was just a native born Hawaiian versus a Samoan. So this was, now you had the same sort of tension from the hometown versus the away team, so to speak. But they were all Islanders, I guess.
Yes.
But that riot, John, incredible story.
Yeah, yeah. And who was it? King Curtis's dad was a cop,
Yes,
I believe. So
or
he
father-in-law. I'm not. They just said it was Rocky
right, it was his
Iakea's
grandfather.
grandfather. I'm not
Right.
sure if it was.
Which side of the family, right?
Yeah,
But he was a police officer, so he was in charge of security. So he lined one side of the ring with Samoan young officers, and the other side with Native Hawaiian officers. And when kind of to keep their own people in line. Just okay, because again, this was 1963, so this was definitely the era of kayfabe could get you stabbed, by the end of the match. And yeah, they they did a they did a spot where Neff came into the corner to come after King Curtis and
yeah. It was
completely good.
it was so Nef Maivia took 80% of the match or whatever, and he throws King Curtis into the corner, and he goes to the other side. He's going to go and do a flying headbutt in the corner, which was his finisher. And in the process of just before, he's about to make contact, King Curtis moves out of the way and takes the turnbuckle pad with him. So Neff Maivia slams into the turnbuckle head first. And of course, he's a bloody mess. And they said that the blood splattered like 30 or 40 feet. So he must have had like a squirt gun or something like that. And they, to continue to sell it, King Curtis ties Neff Maivia's hair in the ropes and pops an Alka-Seltzer in his mouth. The Alka-Seltzer fizzes up, but because he's got blood everywhere, it comes out of his mouth red. So I can imagine it must look like a complete massacre.
Yeah.
And at this point, the Samoan fans have had enough, and they're jumping the barricade. Now, in the back, the High Chief Peter Maivia is waiting to hear the bell to come make the save.
Right.
But the bell never rings because when the fans stand up to jump the barricade, the bell hits the ground, and the timekeeper is like trying to get to it to ring it. Well, he finally does, and he comes out and he rings the bell, and Peter Maivia comes out and he tries to calm the crowd down or whatever, but before he can, a cement brick comes flying out of the crowd and it hits one of the young officers in the head and kills him. And so Peter Maivia eventually calms the crowd down by basically saying, "Don't insult me by trying to do what I'm supposed to do. I've got this under control." And so, I mean, that's the story. But man, talk about your kayfabe. We talked about it in all of these territory episodes, and it really wasn't that long before, like, the bombastic Hulk Hogan era where we all kind of knew that it was just, silly fun. But, go back just 10 years before that, and it wasn't like that.
No, and it speaks to just how iconic of a character High Chief Peter Maivia was, that there's this brawl breaking out, and it's Team A versus Team B. It's the Samoans versus the Hawaiians, who would otherwise be on the same team had a white guy been involved in the match. But maybe it's even extra nasty because it is us versus them, but us and them aren't that different. And the fact that he could just come out, grab the microphone, and say, "Don't insult me. Let me handle this," to keep the cops at bay, to keep it from turning into God only knows what, and that it calmed the people down. They all, to a person, respected him so much. Like, because if you've ever been in any kind, going back to grammar school, when you get into a frenzy and there's a big mob happening, that mob mentality takes over and common sense goes out the window. This man spoke and everyone calmed down. That is amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty incredible. And I always love hearing these stories about, the Rock has, in his opening, he says, in the golden age of professional wrestling, when the wrestling business was protected and the passionate fans still believed. And I love hearing these stories about when the fans believe, because there's just a little bit of extra realism, a lot of extra realism, I guess, that was in the product. And I still have to imagine that at some level, everybody kind of probably still knew that it was a predetermined thing, but they were so much more invested when it was protected. Listen, it's way better that it's not. but these stories just are incredible from the time when it really, really much it was. So, the other kayfabe type of story that they talked about, and it's funny, you and I just did 45 minutes talking about the Montreal screw job and other screw jobs that happened, before that. This one with Kevin Sullivan was sort of a reverse screw job. And it was because he was afraid for his life that if he won the match, he wouldn't make it out of the building.
That was one of the, it was a very quick story. There wasn't a whole lot to it, but that was one of the most amazing stories I think we've heard throughout these 6 episodes. That he's there, and he said the whole way in, they were performing in a rugby stadium, and he's he's driving to the venue and he sees all these, big 300-pound Samoans, and he's watching them, their pig roasts are right out in the open, and he's watching them rip the flesh off the pig that they've just roasted. And he's saying to himself, like, yeah, I don't want to mess with these guys. Then he gets in the building that night and finds out that he's going to go over Siva Afi and win the title. And at this point, the high chief has passed, and Leah and Lars are in charge of the business. And they tell him, don't worry, you're going to be protected. Here's some guy, these are the guys that are going to get you back through the curtain after the match. And as he goes out there, he sees these guys who are supposed to protect him are drinking and, hooting it up with the other guys at ringside that he's worried might kill him if he wins this match. And they had stoked the fires. Leah specifically told him to go out and call the Hawaiian people, or the Samoans, coconut, refer to them as coconuts.
Yeah.
So, the crowd is in a frenzy against this, mainlander who's here fighting their guy. And Siva Afi was hugely over as the champion. And Sullivan just grabs him, pulls him down on top of him. And then the referee doesn't know what the hell's going on. He knows what the script's supposed to be. And Sullivan just looks at the referee and says, count or I'll kill you. 1, 2, 3. And he runs back through the curtain. And I think he said backstage, they didn't even know. They barely knew that the match had started. They were kind of looking at him like, what are you doing back here? What happened? They weren't fully paying attention. But he feared for his life, and there was no way he was going over in front of that crowd.
Yeah, he said that as he went out, he actually felt them closing in on him as he was going out for the match. So he's like, I'm never going to get out of here. And he actually said, they counted 3, and he said 4 seconds later, I was in the back drinking a beer, and Leah's going, go back out there. Go back out there. You need to re-challenge or whatever. So, but there's those two stories really stuck out to me. The other, is interesting, like almost like a reverse kayfabe happened as well when Bruno Harvey Wimpleman came to the territory, and he's going to be a heel manager, so he starts ripping on Samoans, and Leah's like, well, if you don't like us, you can just leave. I don't want you around. And Harvey has to explain, well, I was actually just trying to be a heel. So.
Trying to cut a heel promo here for you. This is what you'd expect.
So we talked about, they sort of just allude to it on the edges. Where they really talk about The Rock an awful lot in terms of the legacy of Leah and Peter Maivia. And of course, he is an enormous aspect of that. But they also showed pictures of Roman Reigns. But you also have the Usos and Rikishi and Yokozuna and the Wild Samoans in WWE and the Head Shrinkers.
Rosie and
yeah, Jamal and Rosie, tons and tons and tons of layers to this family. Jacob Fatu, who's wrestling today, they're everywhere. Yeah. So when Rocky Iakea says, our numbers are small, but our impact is hugely disproportionate, he's not kidding. And this all kind of stems, all of these people stem from what Leah and Peter started in Polynesian Pro Wrestling. So I think I even said at the end of episode 3 that when you ask the question of whatever happened to Polynesian Pro Wrestling, the best answer, the bright side answer, is looking at all of these people and saying that's what happened.
And the legacy lives on and shows no sign of slowing down. I mean, we just saw The Rock's daughter debut in NXT.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a 4th generation on the way.
That's right. The Billy Robinson story from Peter Maivia to tell you, like, this was not. Now this one was gruesome and it had nothing to do with kayfabe. Yeah. It had everything to do with respecting the culture. And when they're at a restaurant and Peter Maivia is eating with his hands, and Billy Robinson calls him a savage, Billy Robinson. Every other story I've ever heard about him is he is a legitimate shooter. He knows how to wrestle and hurt somebody. And here you have him. He gets knocked over. He gets his eyeball torn out, and he gets thrown through a window in like a matter of seconds. Yeah. It's a pretty incredible story.
Yeah, and it almost was out of place in the episode because every other thing about the High Chief was about how warm and obviously he was a badass in the ring, but it was about how warm and wonderful of a human being he was, how respected he was, how loved he was. And here he is having dinner with this other legitimate badass. Took something to be insulting, and before you knew it, he altered the course of this guy's life.
Yeah. Yeah, and they said that after that, that's why you always see him with, you know, a
Go funny
weird
eye.
eye. Yeah. So if you watched Young Rock, there is an episode called Backyard Barbecue,
Yes.
and they talk about having a big event. That event is no doubt a hot summer night. And a hot summer night was an event that they had at Aloha Stadium. There were 12,000 people there. They had names from everywhere. Um, they had, Crockett, AWA, New Japan Pro Wrestling, WWF. They were all there. Titles were on the line. You had the WWF Junior Heavyweight title, the AWA Light Heavyweight title, the NWA World title was on the line in the main event. It was Ric Flair against Siva. And so this was an enormous event, 12,000 people, huge success. And when I was researching episode 3 of the show, I talked about that. I mean, they had all the big names, Andre the Giant, Antonio Inoki, Ric Flair, huge names. This is in 1985. I didn't realize that the Sharks were circling the waters here.
Sure.
And that's what they told last night on the episode, that the reason all of these different promotions were eager to get involved is because they all wanted part of the territory.
Yeah, and I guess she had some other investors already. Like, obviously the territory was hers. Leah ran the territory. Lars was her right-hand man. And between the two of them, they pretty much got everything done they needed to get done. But I guess they had other investors who also kind of wanted more of the territory or a bigger slice of the pie. And Lars Sullivan, there's the horrible story about Lars Sullivan getting jumped after an event by guys that after they were going to kill him. They were beating him half to death, and then they were going to drag him to the water and throw him in the ocean. And either he was going to drown or they were going to drown him. That was the plan. It got broken up by the police or whatever. And I guess these guys were never put to task for it. I don't know if he was afraid to file charges or whatever, but he sat in boardrooms or in meeting rooms going forward across the table from these people for the rest of the run of Polynesian Pro Wrestling. And it's just insane to think that these things went on. And because it was the wrestling business, a lot of times it seems like their justice wasn't done a lot because, well, it's just the wrestling business.
And this happened in Lahaina, which is on the west coast of Maui. And should note that, by the way, between everything that happens in the continental United States, right now we got election results coming in. We have a hurricane about to hit Florida. There's wildfires in western Maui going on right now that are kind of spreading out of control a little bit. So thoughts to those people, I guess, since that we don't really get any news coverage on that. But so yeah, those are crazy stories about people kind of circling the waters. And then they have this other guy who is their commentator, Dunbar Wakayama, who decides, I'm going to run my own promotion. And they're like, okay, well, you're going to owe us a booking fee for anybody that you try to use, any of our wrestlers. And so they kind of threaten him. By kind of, they say they're going to cut off his son's balls and put them in his mouth. So it was fairly serious. He got spooked. He called the FBI. So the FBI gives Dunbar a wire. He goes in, has the meeting with those guys. He pays them off. Money exchanged hands. As Lars and Leah leave, the FBI picks them up, guns drawn, picks them up, puts them in jail. They spend a couple of days in jail, and then they have a long trial, 13 months or something like that is the trial. And I believe the acquittal doesn't come until 89 or something like that. So it's actually the I don't think they did justice to the timeline of events that were happening, because Hot Summer Night was in 1985, Hot Summer Night 2 was 1986, and then this stuff must have happened afterwards. But they were brought up on extortion charges, and it wasn't until the head of the NWA comes in, Bob Geigel, and he explains the whole concept of a booking fee to the jury. And at that point, the customs are understood, and they get their acquittal. But in the meantime, you've had Leah gets deported, and she's got eyes on this trial for this whole time, and she had a bad house, and continue to have bad houses, and she tried to do a run in the west coast of the United States, which they didn't talk about in the documentary. But all that's happening, and at the same time, the other thing they didn't talk about is between 85 and 86, Vince McMahon starts running in Hawaii.
Yeah.
So all of this stuff happens, and it kind of, the bad house, which barely covered the stadium, Aloha Stadium, and then a couple of misses on the west coast of the United States. Vince McMahon comes into Hawaii, and she's busy with extortion trial.
Right.
This is kind of the end of Polynesian Pro Wrestling.
And Vince is no longer sending his talent to her, with a free and open and happy exchange, because he's trying to cut in on that as well. So
yeah. But A Hot Summer Night, the first one, was wildly successful. The second one, they talked about just 1,900 fans there, and what they didn't talk about is the fact that a tropical storm was circling the islands right up until the show. So nobody really wanted. So first of all, wrestlers couldn't get there, and fans didn't want to sit out in the rain for 5 hours because this was an open air stadium. So there, I give them that excuse.
And it's amazing that the way the weather plays a part in that. The big show at Shea Stadium, the very first one, it still did 18,000 fans, but they thought it was going to do close to double that. But it was a rainy, windy day that was unseasonably cold. So that kept the numbers down there. You're talking about 1972. 1983, Crockett runs the first Starrcade, and we always talk about Vince McMahon. He did the first million viewer, I think, or maybe it was $1 million closed circuit, but Crockett beat him to the punch 18 months earlier. It just so happened that most of the closed circuit was going to be in the southern United States, and they were in the middle of an awful winter storm. So a lot of people didn't even leave their house to go to the movie theater and watch it. So they did poor numbers, but that was Crockett's idea. And, just the weather can literally play a part in Vince McMahon is known for WrestleMania. Starrcade, while it went on for 19 or 20 years, whatever it was, it's always kind of seen as lesser than WrestleMania, even though it beat it to the punch. And in this case here, it almost, the weather played a decent part in wiping out a territory.
Yeah, a big part. And, it's funny though, you talk about all those situations with the weather. WrestleMania in 2021 was on delay for night one. Yeah. This was the return after the global pandemic, or maybe we were still in it, depending on who you ask. And probably most people would tell you we were there. I was there in the arena amongst a whole bunch of cardboard cutouts. And yeah, so the thing was delayed. I don't know that very many people didn't go because of that. I mean, most people buy their tickets for those things in advance now, as opposed to those days they were waiting on a big walk-up audience. But yeah, the weather can certainly play a role. And the other thing we didn't say, 12,000 people sourced from the island is incredible.
Yes.
and 1985. So when when Rocky Iakea says, you watch wrestling or watch nothing, I got to imagine in 85 there was something besides wrestling to entertain you with.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Rocky's talking back to when he was a kid in the 1960s,
Right.
where it was, wrestling was only one of three things on. By 85, you know, cable TV is almost ready to break, bust open everything. And
Yeah.
that's what helped Vince McMahon explode his product.
Yes. Yep. So, a fun episode. I think that it's nice because of all the territories, this one I feel like gets talked about maybe the least,
Sure.
despite having such a legacy. I mean, this legacy of the Anawahi dynasty is incredible.
Yeah.
Um, you know, we didn't even talk about it. Rocky Johnson is kind of in there, married into there too. So like, it just it's it's an incredible dynasty, and
It,
an incredible territory.
yeah. And it's completely tangible in today's product and right in front of your face. You can see it every week when you turn on your TV. And in the case of Roman, with rabbit ears, you can pull it out of the sky. You don't even need cable TV because
That's true.
he's on Fox every week, so, or close to every week. But yeah, it's that legacy lives on and still lives very healthily. It's not on its last legs by any means.
Yeah. Next week is Portland, the Pacific Northwest. And this is a territory that, I mean, I know that right now there are whole podcasts that continue to talk about this territory long after it's it's been gone.
Mm.
And so next week, I'm looking forward to some Roddy Piper stories, amongst many others. Uh, Bushwhacker Luke is probably the name that most people are going to know from the
Yeah,
panel next week, who looks great, by the way. Um,
absolutely.
Mike Masters, Len Denton, and Princess Victoria are the other ones. So I'll be really interested. I think it's going to be a fun episode next week.
Yes, because as I've said, growing up in this area, WWF is almost all of my childhood. But I at least knew of some of the other territory. I knew the AWA, I knew Florida, this, that, and the other. I know nothing about the Pacific Northwest
Uh,
territory other than the fact that before he popped on my radar in ECW, Raven was big in that territory. That's about all I know about the territory.
I suggest that you'll find out a lot of really important figures made their starts in Portland next week.
Sure.
So, and including, I don't want to say he made a start, but Roddy Piper was. I mean, that's where he really became Roddy Piper. So,
Sure.
all right, that said, I think that wraps it up for today. Like I said, good episode of Polynesian Pro Wrestling. Don't forget to subscribe. You can listen to a new episode every single day. John, what's coming up tomorrow? November 10th. What's the November 10th episode?
Oh, geez. I should have prepared this, right?
I know I'm looking it up right now. I've got this would be episode number 74, and it is what made Santino's second Intercontinental title run so special. That one was written by you, sir.
This is one of my favorite ones to go through. So, yes, I hope you enjoy it tomorrow morning. There's a good amount of chuckles in it if you're into that kind of thing.
And I'll be closing the week with what title changed hands on Survivor Series Showdown. So it's an oldie but a goodie. I think once you figure out the era we're talking about, you'll be like, not what no titles changed hands at that time. Well, one did. So all right, that said, John, we're out of here. Thanks everybody for listening or watching, because we did this one live video on Facebook. We will talk with you tomorrow.
See ya.